Hello everyone, I am Zex and today I am going to talk about gastroenterology. Gastroenterology is a branch of medicine that focuses on the digestive system and the diseases related to it. The components of digestive system is oral cavity, pharynx, gastrointestinal tract, which consists of esophagus, stomach, small intestine, large intestine, and anal canal. It also includes the accessory organs of the system, which are the pancreas, gallbladder, and liver. Generally, the digestive system is responsible for the breaking down of the food that we consume into nutrients that our body can absorb. Let's get into the detail. But hold on, today we will only be focusing on the primary side of the absorption of nutrients from ingested material, which is the small intestine. The small intestine, which extends from the pylorus to the ileocecal junction, where the ileum joins the cecum, can actually be divided into three parts, which is the duodenum, jejunum, and ileum. Duodenum is the first and the shortest part of the small intestine. It pursues a C-shaped course around the head of the pancreas. It begins at the pylorus on the right side and ends at the duodenojejunal flexure on the left side. The duodenum can be divided into four parts. The superior parts, which is overlapped by the liver. Inferior part that crossed by the root of the mesentery of the jejunum and ileum. The next part is the descending parts, the one that curving around the head of the pancreas. And finally, the last part is the ascending parts that curves anteriorly at the inferior border of the body of the pancreas to join the jejunum at the duodenojejunal flexure, supported by the attachment of a suspensory muscle of the duodenum. Now, moving on to the second and third part of the small intestine. Jejunum, which is the second part of the small intestine, begins at the duodenojejunal flexure, while the third part of the small intestine, the ileum, ends at the ileocecal junction, the union of the terminal ileum and cecum. The jejunum and ileum are 6 to 7 meters long. The jejunum predominantly in the left upper quadrant, while the ileum predominantly in the right lower quadrant. Small intestine is the primary site of nutrients absorption. Thus, the inner lining of the small intestine is covered with a specialized layer of cells and structures that facilitate its function in digestion and nutrients absorption. The innermost layer of small intestine is called mucosa, which is responsible for the majority of the absorption. Enterocytes are the most predominant absorptive cells inside the mucosa. They have the microvilli on their apical surface, which form a brush border. They are also goblet cells that are scattered among the enterocytes and secrete mucus that helps protect the intestinal lining and aids in the movement of material through the digestive tract. There are also lamina propria that located beneath the epithelial layer, which is the connective tissue layers that contains blood vessels, lymphatic vessels, and immune cells. Nutrients absorbed by the enterocytes enter the bloodstream or lymphatic system through vessels in lamina propria. Muscularis mucosa is a thin layer of smooth muscle located beneath the mucosa that creates folding that enhance the surface area. Lastly, villi and microvilli. Villi is the finger-like projections which protrude into the intestinal lumen. Each villus contains a network of blood vessels and lacteal for nutrients transport. Microvilli covers the surface of enterocytes, forming brush border, which further increase the absorptive surface. The movement of the small intestine can be divided into two movements, which is the first one is mixing contraction and the second one is propulsive contraction. The separation of the contractions are actually artificial because essentially all the movements of the small intestine can cause at least some degree of both mixing and propulsion. So let us begin our discussion with the mixing contraction first. Mixing contractions, or also known as segmentation contractions, are generally a contraction that slosh and mix chyme, bring it into contact with the mucosa. Dissentation of stretch receptors in the small intestine elicits localized concentric contractions. The contractions causes segmentation of the small intestine. The intestine divided into spaced segments that have appearance of a chain of sausages. As one set of segmentation contractions relaxes, a new set often begins, but the contractions this time occur at new points which lies between the previous contraction. The segmentation contraction chop the chyme 2 to 3 times per minute to promote progressive mixing of the food with secretions of small intestine. So the second movement is propulsive contractions, a movement that I can say that we all are already familiar with, because propulsive contraction is actually peristalsis, but it occurs in the small intestine. So peristaltic waves is the waves that propel the chyme through small intestine towards the anus. Means it move the chyme throughout the small intestine towards the anus. So peristalsis is stimulated by a decrease in distension once most nutrients have been absorbed. The histological structure of the small intestine reflects its specialized functions in digestion and nutrients absorption. The arrangement of cell types, layers and structures is finely tuned to facilitate efficient absorption of nutrients from the intestinal lumen into the bloodstream. The type of epithelial cell that line the small intestine are the simple columnar epithelium. Dr. William Beaumont is the figure of gastroenterology, who was born in 1785 in Connecticut, US. Dr. Beaumont is the father of the gastric physic. He was the surgeon in the US Army and became the figure of the gastric physic for his research on human digestion on Alex Saint Martin. It all started when Alexis Saint Martin, an illiterate worker, accidentally shot in the chest by a musket. Dr. Beaumont gave fatal prognosis, but nevertheless did everything possible to save his patient's life. To his own surprise, Saint Martin did survive. Saint Martin then developed gastric fistula, that failed to be covered by Dr. Beaumont. That fistula was used by Dr. Beaumont to conduct his study and confirm his view that the main active constituent of gastric juice was hydrochloric acid by measuring gastric secretion and the digestion of various food that he tied to a silk string that he would insert into the stomach of Alexis Saint Martin through the fistula that he failed to cover. His book with the title Experiments and Observations of the Gastric Juice and the Physiology of Digestion immediately received international acclaim and was reprinted for distribution at the first Physiological Congress to be covered in America. Disease that is related with small intestine are celiac disease, or also known as gluten enteropathy. This disease is the result from the toxic effects of gluten present in certain types of grains, especially wheat and rye. Only some people are susceptible to this effect, but in those who are susceptible, gluten has a direct destructive effect on intestinal enterocytes. In milder form, only the microvilli of the absorbing enterocytes on the villi are destroyed, thus decreasing the absorptive surface area as much as twofold. In the more severe form, the villi become blunted or disappear altogether, thus further reducing the absorptive area of the gut. Removal of wet and dry flour from diet frequently results in cure within weeks.